Good morning. This is our final series of short talks preparing you for the course in Regensburg starting tomorrow. Um, Today I'm going to briefly review the third topic, which is a quick look at DOM and jQuery, defining some of these terms and also looking at browser tools in general. Just a quick recap on how we got here. We're starting on Saturday. We have some review of HTML, CSS from a few weeks ago, JavaScript from last week, and this week we're doing a quick tour of these important tools. It's not critical that you're an expert at the DOM and jQuery to do the course, but it provides some useful background information which we will make use of occasionally, so it's not absolutely essential. Let's start by the browser tools. These browser tools are pretty sophisticated now, and perhaps not in the first few weeks, but later in the course, being reasonably adept at Chrome in particular will be quite useful. So let's talk a little bit about those and a little bit how scripts fit into the picture. First of all, a script tag. When we bring in a script tag, we're including JavaScript directly into a web page. We identify the name of the script we want to include, and that script then executes immediately, or it may provide some functions and utilities that are used by other scripts. Usually practice has been to put the script tag towards the end of the page because the files being loaded may be substantial. We're not too worried about that because we're running locally and we're running in development mode anyway. But it's just something to keep an eye on when you're looking at legacy code. Now, the Chrome developer tools are quite powerful. They're hidden away a little bit in the menus, tools, developer tools. And once you turn them on, you get a new control panel down at the bottom of your screen. I'm showing it here. This control panel gives you a very sophisticated range of probes, debugging tools, analyzers on what's going on your page and what's going on across your network. And you will be interested in exploring this at some stage. You can identify the individual page you're looking at, and you can also explore that page, including the JavaScript content of that page. The console will contain output of the console that you may have generated inside any JavaScript code. And again, the lab today, if you have time to do it, will give you an example of how that is working. This is a simple example you might go through later on. We're including a JavaScript file. We're installing a simple event handler around the button, two of them in fact. One which adds a item to a bullet list, and the other which clears that bullet list. These functions came in on script.js, so they're included from a separate file. And you can see the functions in action here. Here we're accessing the DOM to completely clear a given element, and here we are adding new elements into the DOM, which of course will be rendered inside the page immediately. Those examples, you can click through them. They're simple enough to experiment with. They give you a very basic understanding of using and manipulating the DOM from inside a web page using jQuery. Firefox also has a range of tools. These are improving all the time. Not quite as functional as the Chrome ones in certain areas, for our purposes at least, but it's always good to be keeping an eye on what the Firefox people are up to. The newer versions of Firefox are almost, or perhaps faster than Chrome, and that's the first time that has happened. Okay, that's just the quick review of the developer tools, and the lab takes you through those in considerable detail. Just like to talk a little bit now about the DOM, which I've just been discussing briefly here. All browsers support effectively a data structure, and that data structure is called the DOM. It's accessible via JavaScript, and it is a parsed version of the current page hosted by the web browser. And it's no surprise that the structure of the page models the document structure. At a root, children, all pages have a HTML element, a head and a body, and bodies then contain nested elements as dictated by the structure of the page itself. It's a standard. We would expect the browsers to all support these specific APIs here, and it allows us to access and modify individual elements on the page itself. As soon as we make changes to the DOM, then that portion of the DOM is reflected immediately on the rendered page, so we can see the effect of our changes. Everything is a node in the DOM, so it's effectively a nested acyclic graph, if we want the formal definition of it, and we can traverse that DOM going to descendants or going to children or going to siblings using standard tree terminology. When we open a page, the document is loaded, and once that document is loaded, we have access to it. And here we can retrieve a specific element, and in this case we're putting up a simple dialog showing how what size the map element, for instance, is in our page. Here's some examples of more DOM access. In this example, we're getting at the document, getting a specific element, and changing its content. So we'll see a string appearing on the screen. Here is another example whereby we are installing an event handler which will be triggered when we press a button. And here are some of the buttons we've been using. Get element by ID, get element by name, get elements by tag name. I think these are fairly self-explanatory. Get element by ID means we're retrieving elements based on the ID we may have annotated the element with in our HTML code. So we're retrieving a specific element. Till IDs, remember, are unique, so only one element will be retrieved here. Get element by name means we're retrieving element by the name attribute, if that is the case. And by tag name means we're retrieving, and this will be a collection of elements, by the image, by the element tag name itself. It could be an image in this instance. We get hide and retrieve elements. Here we're setting an element to be visible or not visible, in which case we're making visual adjustments to the page itself. And here's the same code using jQuery. We'll talk about jQuery very shortly. Just pause on that for a moment. This is using the DOM data structure exposed by browsers in a standard manner. This is, as you can see, a little bit more concise code. It seems to be doing something comparable to CSS selection, and we seem to be able to do the same feature in both. And this is using a library called jQuery, which I'm going to talk about shortly. Just some more examples here in semantic UI. We mentioned this a few weeks ago. This is the library we're going to use. Semantic UI gives us quite a powerful and elegant visual interface, and we choose to use semantic UI largely because it saves us the burden of doing extensive UI work. Using semantic UI, though, occasionally we do need to enable semantic UI features, and we do that via jQuery. So this is an example of code we'll be inserting into our projects very occasionally. Now, the DOM itself has got a bit of a bad name over the years. Famous quote from Douglas Crawford, a vast source of incompatibilities, pain and misery. That's not quite true now anymore. The last 5 years or so, particularly with the arrival of evergreen browsers, we have quite stable APIs. The need to use jQuery has diminished somewhat. Okay, so what is this jQuery thing I've been talking about? Because it's kind of implicitly involved in our understanding of how the DOM works. I'm going to talk about jQuery here now for a few moments. jQuery is a library. That's all. It's got a funny name. It's not a database library as such. It's just a library for accessing the DOM. It has alternatives which you can look into, but it's so widely used, it's probably essential that you have a basic understanding of jQuery, even if you're not going to use it largely on your projects in this particular course. Its purpose really was to simplify access to the DOM, and in that simplification ensure we had cross-platform support in the DOM, such that you could build web pages that would function reasonably well across different browsers. Its presence on the net is pretty colossal, really. The number of sites in use is profound. Perhaps some evidence that it's declining slightly. Other frameworks now that are larger in scope have taken on a more front and center role. But it is probably going to be with us for many more years. So acquiring jQuery skills is not a waste of time, really. Essentially, it allows us to access the DOM to change content, change attributes, change the style, install event handlers, and it's got some animation facilities. Typically, we access the DOM in a manner comparable to how we would use CSS selectors. And that gives us a convenient notation that may be already part of the developer's mindset. Here's some examples here, and again you might do this in the lab. We're able to here access the element div and report its length. This example we are using the dollar keyword, which allows us to directly identify an element div and find out in particular how large that element is. Some more examples here on traversing and installing event handlers. Again, you might try this in the lab, method chaining. But let's get to the core of it. jQuery function is available via $. And that can seem a little bit alien to programmers' conventional languages, but $. Is just an object, that's all. It's an object that exposes function, and then that simple function allows us to retrieve and access elements of the page using the $. Function itself. Now there's associated variations on this. We talk about a jQuery function and a jQuery method. Here's an example of a method here which allows us to perform some function on an individual element. An example here of traversing an array in jQuery. We won't be using this code or anything like this. I'm just mentioning it as we go along because it's something you will see in practice in legacy code. And here's another example of accessing an array using the each method to invoke a function on each element. Again, don't worry about this, we're not going to be using it in our program. jQuery itself, where do we get it from? Well, you can download it from jQuery.com, stick it into your project, or you can directly include it in your project from a CDN. You might recall we were using some CDN mechanisms to retrieve the semantic UI libraries a few weeks ago. Well, jQuery can be retrieved in the same manner. The library itself, well, you probably don't want to look too closely into it. It's many hundreds of lines long, extensively based around regular expression syntax. So you're unlikely to be interested in editing or modifying it in any way. And anyway, you probably normally include a minified version. And a minified version of a jQuery library is unreadable. It's entirely compressed. Okay, the scope then of the jQuery object, can be loaded here when we incorporate the script element, and that script element allows us to access the global window object here, and that window object can dictate what it is we're displaying on screen at any given point. Once we've got our page loaded, the dollar function allows us to modify the DOM loaded by the window. So here I'm accessing element using the ID selector syntax. Here we're using the class syntax. And here we're dynamically creating a new element, which we made and attached to the DOM at some location. In the lab, if you look at it briefly, you'll be able to append elements directly into the DOM and watch them appear. And we'll also take a quick look at IFEs, immediately invoked function expressions. Again, we won't need to use these, but being aware of what they are can be important. Here in this code, this particular fragment is going to be executed when the page loads. So we're ensuring that it occurs at least once. Whereas here in this variant, the function is just defined, but it's not actually loaded. So it's two slightly different concepts here. Okay, the library itself then, it may be declining somewhat. It's quite large now, 10,000 lines. The framework we'll be using in our course is not jQuery, in fact. We're going to be using a framework called Aurelia, which is a more modern breed of frameworks that supersedes jQuery and jQuery's usage. We'll be discussing that in about 3 or 4 weeks from now. Okay, that's a quick review just of some of the background of the browser tools, the DOM and jQuery. We will not really be taking too much time at those technologies in our course. However, if you do have time before we start just to go through this lab, it's quite short. We'll just give you a very brief feel for jQuery and how it can be used, and might just make us a little bit more confident in the browser tools we're going to use. Okay, that's it. Looking forward to our session starting tomorrow, and we'll talk to you then.